Love does not justify everything. Part 1. Love is, without a doubt, one of the deepest and most transcendent experiences in human life. From an early age, we have been taught that to love is to give oneself unconditionally, that when love is true, there are no conditions, and that love can overcome anything. We have been instilled with the idea that an authentic romantic relationship must withstand any obstacle, any storm, and any suffering, because if love is real, then it is worth fighting for at any cost. However, this vision, as romantic as it is dangerous, has led many people to justify the unjustifiable, to endure the unbearable, and to prolong relationships that, far from enriching them, slowly destroy them. Walter Riso, in The Limits of Love, exposes the fallacy of this belief and reminds us that love should not be synonymous with absolute sacrifice or suffering. There is a vast difference between loving with commitment and surrendering our dignity in the name of love. There is no valid justification for allowing mistreatment, indifference, or abuse simply because we feel love for someone. The moment a person clings to a relationship that harms them, that demands they give up their identity, or that imposes constant suffering, we are no longer talking about love, but about a form of destructive attachment that must be identified and eradicated. The problem with unconditional love is that it turns a person into a willing victim of their relationship. One falls into the trap of believing that if love is genuine, then one must endure everything, justify any attitude, and accept any treatment without question. As a result, many people end up tolerating infidelities, emotional abuse, neglect, and even violence, hoping that, over time, the relationship will improve or that their partner will change. However, the reality is that love alone does not have the power to transform anyone. No matter how much love is given to someone who does not respect, care for, or value their partner, without real reciprocity, the only outcome is emotional exhaustion and a deep sense of emptiness. One of the most common ways in which love becomes a justification for suffering is when a person gives up their own identity for the sake of the relationship. Often, the fear of losing the other leads people to compromise fundamental aspects of their identity, sacrificing their life projects, dreams, and even emotional well-being just to maintain the relationship. At some point, personal happiness ceases to be a priority, and all energy is directed toward pleasing and sustaining the partner. This self-renunciation is not love. It is a form of self-annihilation disguised as romance. Healthy love does not mean losing oneself in the other, but sharing life while remaining true to oneself. A relationship in which one person must fade away so that the other can shine is not a balanced relationship, but a toxic bond where one thrives at the expense of the other. Loving someone should never mean giving up one's dignity, voice, or essence. If being with someone requires paying the price of submission or suffering, then that love has ceased to be genuine and has become an emotional trap that is difficult to escape. Another danger of the belief that love justifies everything is a tendency to excuse harmful behaviors. Many people find reasons to stay with partners who hurt them, hoping that their love will change the situation. Phrases like, "deep down they love me," "when they're in a good mood, they're wonderful," or "I know they will change with time," are common among those who cling to unhealthy relationships. But true change does not depend on the love one feels for someone. It depends on the other person's willingness to modify their behavior. No one should stay in a relationship expecting a miraculous transformation that may never come. Someone who truly loves does not hurt, humiliate, or repeatedly betray their partner's trust. One of the fundamental aspects that Walter Riso highlights is that love is not enough to sustain a relationship. Beyond love, there must be respect, mutual admiration, shared values, and, above all, clear boundaries. These boundaries are not walls that prevent connection, but basic principles that ensure the relationship remains healthy. Without boundaries, love becomes fertile ground for manipulation and emotional abuse. It is crucial to understand that love alone should not be an argument to justify relationships that harm us. Loving someone does not mean tolerating everything they do or forgiving endlessly without consequences. Love should not be a free pass for someone to act without considering the other person's well-being. In this sense, we need to change how we understand love. Instead of seeing it as a feeling that must be upheld at all costs, we should view it as a conscious choice in which both people feel fulfilled and respected. Loving with emotional intelligence means recognizing when a relationship is draining us and when it is necessary to set boundaries. Walking away from someone who harms us is not selfishness. It is self-love. Someone who loves us in a healthy way will not demand impossible sacrifices or ask us to give up our happiness for them. It is essential to emphasize that no one deserves a relationship where love is used as an excuse for mistreatment, neglect, or a lack of commitment. If a relationship requires enduring constant pain to function, then what is being experienced is not love, but a form of emotional dependence. Truly healthy relationships do not require such a high price to work. No matter how much love one feels for someone, if that person does not respect the basic boundaries of dignity and respect, then the bond becomes a source of suffering. The belief that love justifies everything has led many people to lose themselves in relationships that do not make them happy, that diminish them, and that condemn them to a life of frustration. For Walter Riso, it is crucial that we learn to set boundaries and prioritize our own emotional integrity. No matter how much we love someone, if that relationship threatens our well-being, the healthiest thing to do is to let go. Sometimes, the greatest act of love we can give ourselves is having the courage to walk away from what harms us. Loving with maturity does not mean clinging at all costs, but knowing when it is time to let go. It is not about giving up on love, but about understanding that love should not be synonymous with suffering. It is neither realistic nor healthy to expect love to heal all wounds or justify all actions. Loving with intelligence means understanding that love has limits, and that those limits are necessary for a relationship to be a space of well-being and mutual growth. We must break away from the idea that love is about endurance and sacrifice, and instead build relationships based on respect and reciprocity. Because, at the end of the day, the love that is truly worthwhile is the one that does not require us to lose ourselves. Self-love versus extreme sacrifice, Part 2. Since time immemorial, love has been portrayed as the most powerful and transcendent force in a person's life. It has been idealized to the point of turning it into a life mission, the ultimate driver of happiness, and the noblest sacrifice one can make for another. Literature, cinema, and popular culture have reinforced the idea that true love is one that gives everything without expecting anything in return, that surrenders completely without conditions or limits. This romantic and almost sacred concept has led many people to believe that truly loving someone requires sacrificing oneself, giving up personal identity, and prioritizing the happiness of the other above one's own. However, Walter Riso, in The Limits of Love, dismantles this idea and exposes how extreme sacrifice in love is not only unnecessary, but can also be deeply harmful. Loving someone does not mean disappearing within the relationship or annulling oneself as an individual. Many people fall into the trap of believing that, for a relationship to work, they must yield in everything, abandon their own interests, and make their partner the absolute priority in their life. They confuse love with submission and devotion with the loss of identity. The problem with this mentality is that, in the long run, it creates an unsustainable imbalance in the relationship. When one person is willing to sacrifice everything for their partner without receiving the same in return, a power dynamic is established where one constantly gives while the other simply receives, without concern for reciprocity. Love then becomes an unequal space where devotion is one-sided, and the person making all the sacrifices eventually loses themselves. It is common to hear phrases like, "If you really love me, you would do this for me." Love requires compromise, or a relationship demands sacrifice. These statements can be dangerous when taken to the extreme, as they reinforce the idea that love justifies any kind of personal renunciation. But the reality is that true love does not demand the destruction of the self or absolute self-denial. If being with someone requires abandoning one's dreams, values, or dignity, then it is not love, but emotional dependence disguised as romance. Healthy love is one in which both individuals can grow and develop, without one having to disappear in the process. One of the greatest dangers of extreme sacrifice in love is that it creates unbalanced and, in many cases, toxic relationships. Those who are accustomed to receiving without giving eventually stop valuing their partner's efforts and start taking them for granted. In these types of relationships, the person who constantly sacrifices themselves is usually the one who suffers the most, as they gradually realize that their needs are secondary and that their happiness depends solely on making their partner happy. This can lead to feelings of frustration, emptiness, and resentment, as excessive giving is never enough when it is not mutual. Sacrificing oneself for love can also be a sign of insecurity and fear of loneliness. Many people abandon themselves in their relationships because they believe that if they don't, they will be abandoned or rejected. They live with the feeling that their worth as a person depends on how much they are willing to give and how much they can endure in the name of love. They cling to the relationship even when it becomes harmful, because the fear of being alone is stronger than the desire to be happy. This mindset stems from a lack of self-love, since a person who truly values themselves would never allow a relationship to consume or destroy them. Self-love is not selfishness, nor does it mean loving one's partner any less. On the contrary, it is a foundation of any healthy and balanced relationship. A person who loves themselves knows how to set boundaries, knows how to say no when something is harmful, and understands that their happiness should not depend exclusively on another person. Loving with emotional intelligence means recognizing that a relationship should be a space of mutual well-being, not a constant battle of sacrifices and renunciations. If a relationship requires one person to disappear or wear themselves out to exhaustion, then it is not a healthy relationship. Often, extreme sacrifice in love is not a conscious decision, but the result of deeply ingrained beliefs in society and education. From childhood, we are taught that true love means total devotion and suffering. In the most famous love stories, the protagonist is willing to do anything for the person they love, even if it means losing themselves in the process. These ideas have taken such deep root in people's minds that many never even question whether what they are doing in the name of love is actually fair to them. It is essential to learn to differentiate between a healthy sacrifice and a harmful one. In every relationship, there are moments when compromise is necessary, but this must be reciprocal and should never put either person's identity or dignity at risk. Love does not mean enduring everything or accepting any condition out of fear of losing the other person. Someone who truly loves their partner respects and values them as they are, without demanding that they give up their essence or sacrifice their happiness in the name of love. One of the most important lessons from the limits of love is that a healthy relationship is built on reciprocity and mutual respect. It is not about who gives more or who sacrifices more, but about finding a balance where both people feel valued and fulfilled. Love should not be a battlefield of constant renunciations, but a space where each person can be free without fear of losing the other. People who have spent years sacrificing themselves in the name of love often realize, sooner or later, that they have lost more than they have gained. When they look back, they see all the opportunities they let slip away, all the times they put their partner's desires above their own, and all the decisions they made based on fear and the need for approval. At that point, many feel deep sadness as they realize that in their effort to keep the relationship alive, they have forgotten themselves. But it is never too late to regain self-esteem and start building healthier and more balanced relationships. Loving someone does not mean being their shadow or living solely for their well-being at the cost of one's own. It does not mean abandoning one's dreams or sacrificing one's happiness just to please another person. True love is about sharing life without losing oneself, about finding someone to walk hand in hand with, without losing the path. When self-love becomes a priority, relationships stop being a burden and transform into spaces of mutual growth and well-being. Because at the end of the day, the only way to truly love another person is to first learn to love oneself. The Myth of Unconditional Love, Part 3. Unconditional love is one of the most deeply ingrained ideas in the collective imagination. We have been told that true love expects nothing in return, that it must be eternal, limitless, and capable of withstanding any challenge. Literature, music, and cinema have glorified this idea, turning it into a romantic ideal that many people take as a model for their relationships. However, behind the seemingly noble and selfless notion lies a dangerous concept that can lead to self-annihilation, suffering, and the justification of harmful relationships. Loving without conditions, regardless of circumstances or consequences, is not a virtue, but an emotional trap that prevents people from setting healthy boundaries and protecting their well-being. The fundamental problem with unconditional love is that it denies the reality of human nature and interpersonal relationships. Every relationship requires balance, respect, and reciprocity to be healthy. However, the idea of unconditional love suggests that one must love regardless of the other person's actions, without setting any boundaries and without expecting even the slightest reciprocity. This concept implies that no matter what happens, love should remain intact, meaning that even if someone is humiliated, mistreated, or ignored, their love should be stronger than any offense. This romanticized view of love has led many people to tolerate abusive relationships, believing that love means enduring and resisting any circumstance, no matter how painful. The culture of unconditional love has normalized dynamics where one person gives everything without receiving even the bare minimum in return. Under this mindset, love becomes a perpetual sacrifice where the only priority is making the other person happy, regardless of whether that means postponing one's own needs, desires, or even personal dignity. This kind of blind devotion is not a demonstration of genuine love, but of emotional dependence. Loving does not mean giving up oneself or losing one's individuality for the sake of another. A balanced relationship should be a space of mutual well-being, where both partners feel valued and cared for, not a structure in which one person single-handedly sustains a relationship through irrational devotion. Love, like any other human bond, is subject to natural conditions. It is impossible to love someone who constantly humiliates, betrays, or mistreats us, at least not without paying a high emotional price. Loving under any circumstance is not only unfair, but also a way of allowing others to trample our dignity without facing any consequences. Love, when it is healthy, must be dynamic and capable of evolving. If a relationship becomes toxic, if a person feels constantly unhappy, or if respect and trust are lost, love should change, transform, or even fade away. The idea that love must remain unbreakable despite collateral damage is a harmful belief that traps people in relationships that are no longer functional. The notion of unconditional love also reinforces the idea that love is a matter of fate, something that simply happens and over which we have no control. However, the reality is that love is a daily construction that requires effort, commitment, and above all, conscious decisions. It is not a magical and immutable feeling that must endure regardless of circumstances. Believing in unconditional love removes personal responsibility from relationships and perpetuates the false idea that love is something one simply feels rather than something one nurtures. A person should not love without conditions, but rather establish clear boundaries regarding what they are willing to accept and what they are not. Unconditional love, when taken to the extreme, can also lead to a dangerous lack of self-esteem in those who practice it. When someone believes that their duty is to love no matter how they are treated, they end up neglecting their own well-being and justifying behaviors that should be unacceptable. Many people who defend the idea of unconditional love convince themselves that any problem in a relationship can be solved with more love, which leads them to stay in situations that cause them harm. However, love is not a magical tool that fixes everything by itself. If a person is constantly disregarded or ignored in a relationship, loving more will not change the situation. What is truly needed is respect, communication, and the willingness of both parties to improve the relationship. Another negative effect of unconditional love is that it fosters emotional dependence. Those who believe in this type of love often develop an irrational fear of losing their partner, leading them to tolerate behaviors they would otherwise reject. They convince themselves that if their love is strong enough, they will be able to endure any adversity, keeping them trapped in harmful relationships for long periods. In many cases, this mindset also becomes an obstacle to making rational decisions. A person who believes in unconditional love may ignore red flags and continue clinging to a relationship that is clearly unhealthy simply because they have internalized the idea that true love has no limits or conditions. Healthy love should not be synonymous with endurance or self-denial. Those who advocate for unconditional love often confuse tolerance with resignation, believing that a love is to accept any circumstance without question. However, a healthy relationship is one in which both partners feel valued and respected, not one in which one person is constantly given without receiving anything in return. Loving wisely means recognizing that love alone is not enough to sustain a relationship if there is no respect, compatibility, and emotional well-being. This is not about loving with selfish conditions, but about setting boundaries that protect the integrity of both the relationship and the individuals involved. It is neither healthy nor fair to continue loving someone who harms or makes us unhappy just because we have adopted the idea that love must be unbreakable. Accepting that love has limits does not mean loving less. It means loving better. It means recognizing that a relationship should be a space for mutual growth, not an emotional prison where one is expected to give endlessly without receiving anything in return. Walter Riso makes it clear that unconditional love is not an ideal to aspire to, but a dangerous construct that can lead people to neglect themselves in the name of affection. Learning to love with intelligence and boundaries is the key to building balanced and fulfilling relationships. No matter how much someone is loved, if that relationship robs them of their peace, deprives them of their happiness, or constantly makes them feel inadequate, then it is no longer love. It has become a form of dependence. Real love is not blind devotion or absolute submission. It is a balance in which both partners care for and value each other equally, without demanding self-sacrifice in the name of an idealized love that, in reality, only brings suffering. Necessary boundaries in love. Part 4. Love is one of the most powerful and transformative forces in human life, but it can also become a source of suffering if not managed with emotional intelligence. Many people believe that setting boundaries in love is an act of selfishness or a way of placing conditions on the affection they feel for their partner, when in reality, the opposite is true. Setting boundaries is a way to preserve respect, dignity, and harmony within the relationship. Love without boundaries is love exposed to abuse, emotional exhaustion, and the loss of identity for one or both partners. It is not about building impenetrable walls, but about clearly defining how far one is willing to go without compromising personal well-being. Boundaries in love are essential because they distinguish a healthy relationship from a toxic one. In a relationship where no clear boundaries exist, it is easy to fall into dynamics where one person gives too much while the other only receives. When someone does not know how to say no out of fear of losing their partner, they end up constantly yielding, losing their autonomy, and relegating their own needs to the background. This type of imbalance generates resentment and progressive emotional exhaustion that, sooner or later, destroys a relationship or turns love into a burden. Loving does not mean giving into everything or accepting anything in the name of the relationship. Love implies mutual respect, and that respect is only maintained when both people understand their limits and ensure that their dignity remains intact. One of the most common mistakes in relationships is the belief that love can overcome everything and that, for this reason, there is no need to establish rules or boundaries. This idea can be dangerous, as it leads many people to accept behaviors that harm them, hoping that love alone will be enough to balance the situation. But love by itself does not resolve fundamental differences or justify actions that compromise a person's well-being. Without boundaries, a relationship becomes a space where a partner's actions may be unpredictable and where personal needs are constantly neglected. Boundaries are also necessary to prevent emotional manipulation. In many relationships, one person may try to control the other through guilt, blackmail, or victimization. Phrases like, "If you really love me, you would do this to me," or "I am nothing without you, please don't leave me," are examples of manipulation intended to bend the other person's will in the name of love. A person without clear boundaries may fall into these emotional traps and end up in a relationship where their decisions no longer belong to them. Setting boundaries means not falling into these manipulative games and being able to recognize when someone is trying to control us to get what they want. Healthy love should not feel like a prison or a series of impossible demands. Another fundamental aspect is that boundaries protect individuality within the relationship. Many couples make the mistake of completely merging, losing their unique identities in the process. It is true that a relationship involves sharing time, interests, and common projects, but that does not mean each person should give up their individual world. Every person has a right to their own spaces, friendships, and personal activities, without these being seen as a threat to the relationship. When someone feels they need permission to see friends, that they cannot enjoy their hobbies without their partner's approval, or that every decision must be filtered through their partner's preferences, it is a clear sign that boundaries are not well defined. A relationship should be a space where both individuals can fully develop without feeling that their autonomy is at risk. Setting boundaries is also a way to prevent both physical and emotional abuse. Many times, the absence of boundaries leads someone to tolerate behaviors that gradually escalate into aggression. Abuse does not begin overnight. It often starts with small acts of disrespect that, if not addressed early, become normalized within the relationship. If someone allows insults, shouting, or belittling because they believe it is part of a normal relationship, they are sending the message that such behaviors are acceptable. Establishing clear boundaries from the beginning prevents a relationship from becoming a space where abuse is tolerated or justified in the name of love. Additionally, boundaries allow the relationship to be a space of mutual well-being rather than a battleground for power. Many couples fall into dominance dynamics where one person makes all the decisions while the other simply complies to avoid conflict. Without boundaries, a relationship can easily become one where one partner imposes will over the other, creating an environment of inequality and submission. On the other hand, when both partners have clear boundaries, the relationship is built on respect and fairness, where neither person must unilaterally submit to the other's desires. At the same time, setting boundaries does not mean closing the door to dialogue or flexibility. It is natural for relationships to require negotiation and compromise at times, but these compromises should be balanced and should respect the dignity of both individuals. Boundaries should not be rigid barriers or an excuse to refuse commitment in important aspects of the relationship. Rather, they should help both partners find a middle ground where they feel comfortable and respected. Healthy boundaries are established through communication and clarity, not through impositions or emotional punishments. People who do not set boundaries in their relationships often experience frustration, exhaustion, and confusion. Over time, the absence of boundaries leads to a sense of emptiness, as a person feels they have lost control over their own life and that their needs are no longer a priority. Many experience deep emotional exhaustion from having given too much without receiving anything in return. In some cases, when they finally decide to set boundaries, their partner resists or reacts negatively because they have become accustomed to receiving without limits. However, this should not be a reason to give up. Learning to set boundaries may be uncomfortable at first, but over time, it becomes an essential tool for building healthier and more fulfilling relationships. Love without boundaries is not love. It is a form of emotional submission that endangers both the stability of the relationship and the well-being of those involved. Learning to say, "This is as far as I go," is an act of self-love and a sign of emotional maturity. A truly healthy relationship is one where both partners feel free to be themselves without fear of losing the other. Loving with boundaries does not mean loving less. It means loving with responsibility and respect. Ultimately, the key to a lasting and balanced relationship is not how much we are willing to sacrifice, but how much we are capable of respecting both ourselves and the person we choose to love. Attachment and Emotional Dependence, Part 5. Attachment is a deep emotional bond that humans develop with others from infancy. It is a natural mechanism that allows us to connect with people and build meaningful relationships. However, when attachment turns into emotional dependence, love ceases to be a source of well-being and becomes an emotional trap that causes suffering. Emotional dependence is one of the most destructive ways to experience love, as it is based on extreme need for the other person, fear of loss, and the inability to conceive of life without a partner. This type of bond is not sustained by the conscious choice to share life with someone, but by the impossibility of being alone, leading many people to cling to relationships that harm them or no longer bring them happiness. Emotional dependence is, at its core, a relationship of inequality where one person emotionally submits to the other out of fear of loneliness or abandonment. This type of attachment is not based on genuine love, but on insecurity and a constant need for validation. People who suffer from emotional dependence often experience an irrational fear of losing their partner, and to avoid this, they are willing to tolerate situations that go against their well-being. They justify neglect, accept unfair treatment, and even abandon their own values just to keep the relationship alive. In these cases, love stops being a choice and turns into a pathological need, an addiction where the partner becomes the only source of meaning in life. One of the clearest signs of emotional dependence is the loss of identity. The dependent person adapts their tastes, interests, and behaviors to match their partners, neglecting their individuality to fit into the relationship. Their decisions are no longer their own, but are dictated by the fear of displeasing or being rejected. Over time, this person stops doing the things they enjoy, distances themselves from their social circles, and becomes an extension of their partner. This phenomenon is especially dangerous because it erodes self-esteem, making a dependent person believe that their worth is entirely tied to the relationship. Without their partner, they feel like they are nothing, that their life has no meaning, and that they cannot move forward. The root of emotional dependence is often found in past experiences of emotional deprivation or learned patterns from childhood. Many people who grew up in environments where love was associated with suffering or where relationships were marked by instability develop a deep fear of abandonment. As adults, they seek security and affection in their partners to compensate for what they lacked in the past, but they do so in an excessive way, placing the other person on a pedestal and making them responsible for their happiness. The problem with this type of attachment is that it never feels like enough. The dependent person always needs more attention, more proof of love, more presence, because their emotional security does not come from within but from external validation. Another characteristic of emotional dependence is a tolerance of the intolerable. A person who cannot conceive of life without their partner is willing to endure almost anything to avoid losing them. They justify disrespect, minimize problems, and normalize behaviors that, under other circumstances, they would consider unacceptable. They convince themselves that love forgives everything and that any suffering is preferable to a breakup. This mindset can lead to relationships where manipulation, emotional abuse, or even violence occurs, as a dependent person is so afraid of being alone that they justify any behavior from their partner just to avoid abandonment. One of the biggest problems with emotional dependence is that it creates a cycle of permanent dissatisfaction. The dependent person never feels completely secure in a relationship, so they constantly seek reassurance that their partner loves them. However, no amount of affection or attention is ever enough because the emotional void they feel cannot be filled by another person. This overwhelming need for security often causes conflicts in a relationship, as a partner of the dependent person may feel suffocated by their emotional demands. Dependence manifests in behaviors such as a need to always be together, difficulty making decisions without consulting the other, excessive jealousy, and an irrational fear of the relationship ending. Overcoming emotional dependence is not easy, but it is possible. The first step is recognizing that love should not be a necessity, but a choice. It is crucial to understand that happiness does not depend on being with someone, but on building a healthy relationship with oneself. Many people believe that they cannot be happy without their partner, but what they're actually experiencing is not love. It is fear of loneliness. To break free from dependence, it is essential to work on self-esteem and self-worth. A person who feels secure within themselves does not need to cling desperately to someone else to feel complete. Another key aspect of overcoming emotional dependence is learning to enjoy solitude. Many dependent individuals fill their lives with their partner's presence because they fear facing their own emotional emptiness. However, solitude does not have to be negative. It can be an opportunity to reconnect with oneself, discover personal interests, and develop a fulfilling life outside the relationship. Learning to be alone and appreciate emotional independence is one of the best ways to avoid falling into relationships where love is driven by need rather than genuine choice. Setting boundaries within the relationship is also fundamental. A dependent person must learn to say no, to express their own needs, and to resist giving in to the fear of abandonment. This does not mean becoming indifferent or distant, but finding a balance where the relationship is not a source of distress. A healthy relationship is one where both partners can enjoy love without feeling trapped, where each person's individuality is respected, and where being together is a conscious decision rather than an emotional obligation. Emotional dependence is one of the biggest obstacles to experiencing a fulfilling and healthy love life. When a person feels they cannot live without their partner, what they are really experiencing is not love, but an unresolved emotional need. Love should not be a prison or a chain, but a space for growth and well-being. Building a healthy relationship requires loving with freedom, respect, and without fear of loss. Only when a person is capable of being at peace with themselves can they truly choose to share their life with someone else without falling into dependence. True love is not a desperate need, but a connection based on respect, admiration, and emotional independence. Love and Personal Dignity, Part 6. Love is one of the deepest and most enriching experiences a human being can have. However, when love becomes an excuse to endure humiliation, mistreatment, or injustice, it ceases to be a positive force and turns into a mechanism of self-destruction. Loving should never mean losing one's dignity. Yet many people find themselves trapped in relationships where their self-worth is constantly violated. Dignity is a foundation upon which a healthy and balanced relationship is built, and when it is compromised in the name of love, the relationship ceases to be a space for growth and well-being and instead becomes a source of suffering and personal degradation. Personal dignity means recognizing oneself as a valuable being, deserving of respect and fair treatment. It is the inalienable right to be treated with consideration and to not allow anyone to diminish or make us feel less than we are. In a romantic relationship, dignity is reflected in the ability to set boundaries, demand mutual respect, and refuse to accept any behavior that undermines self-esteem and emotional stability. Loving does not mean tolerating the intolerable or justifying behaviors that cause harm in the name of affection. When love demands a renunciation of dignity, it is no longer love. It becomes a form of submission. Many people who sacrifice their dignity in a relationship do so gradually and almost imperceptibly. At first, they may justify their partner's behavior by believing that no one is perfect or that all relationships have ups and downs. Slowly, they start conceding on aspects they once considered non-negotiable, accepting acts of disrespect as occasional occurrences, and altering their behavior to avoid conflict. In an attempt to sustain a relationship, they prioritize their partner's needs and desires over their own, believing that this is what love requires. However, what is truly happening is a progressive erosion of their self-esteem and a normalization of attitudes that should never be accepted. One of the clearest signs that someone has lost their dignity in a relationship is when they constantly justify their partner's mistreatment or indifference. Phrases like, when they're in a good mood, they're wonderful. They weren't always like this. They used to treat me better. Or maybe I'm exaggerating and should be more patient indicate that love has ceased to be a source of happiness and has instead become an emotional burden. Justifying mistreatment is one of the most dangerous forms of self-deception because it convinces a person that their suffering is a natural part of the relationship and that they must keep fighting despite everything. Dignity in love is also compromised when someone becomes subjected to control and domination within the relationship. Some relationships involve one partner exerting excessive control over the other, limiting their freedom, imposing arbitrary rules, and emotionally manipulating them to maintain power. In such cases, the controlled person may feel trapped, believing that their only option is to comply to avoid conflict. The loss of autonomy is one of the most alarming signs that a relationship has become an environment of abuse and submission. Dignity means having the ability to make one's own decisions without fear of retaliation, to express opinions without the risk of being judged, and to live freely without feeling constantly monitored or conditioned. Another way dignity is compromised in love is when someone accepts being in a relationship where they are neither valued nor prioritized. Many times, the fear of loneliness leads people to settle for mere scraps of affection, hoping that their partner will eventually change and start giving the love they deserve. In these situations, they assume a secondary role in the relationship, always waiting to be seen, heard, or acknowledged. Dignity should not depend on external validation or the amount of attention received in a relationship. It should be an internal conviction that prevents accepting less than one deserves. Personal dignity is also reflected in the ability to walk away from a relationship when it is no longer space for well-being. Many people stay in unhappy relationships because they believe their love is enough to sustain them, even when all evidence suggests otherwise. They hold on to the hope that their partner will change, that things will improve with time, or that their sacrifices will eventually be rewarded. However, love should not be a constant struggle or an endurance test for pain. Having dignity in love means recognizing when a relationship is no longer healthy and having the courage to leave, even when it hurts. Learning to love with dignity requires strengthening self-esteem and self-love. A person who values themselves does not accept less than they deserve, does not allow others to treat them with contempt, and does not cling to relationships where they are unhappy. Self-love is a foundation of any healthy relationship because it sets a minimum standard of respect and consideration that cannot be negotiated. A person with dignity does not need their partner to make them feel valuable because they already know their worth. They do not beg for affection or settle for crumbs of love because they understand that love should not be a source of suffering. To build a relationship based on dignity, both partners must share values of respect, equality, and mutual admiration. Love alone is not enough. It must be demonstrated through concrete actions that reflect care and appreciation for the other person. Dignity in love does not mean being inflexible or unwilling to compromise. It means finding a balance where neither partner has to completely sacrifice themselves for the relationship to work. When both individuals feel respected and valued, love flows naturally and becomes a source of growth and happiness. Love and dignity should never be in conflict. There is no reason to choose between loving and being respected, between being in a relationship and maintaining one's identity. A truly healthy relationship is one where both partners can love each other without renouncing their essence, without losing their voice or autonomy. Loving with dignity does not mean loving less. It means loving in a more conscious and balanced way. It means understanding that love is not about constant sacrifice or a test of endurance, but rather a space where one can be free, fulfilled, and valued. Someone who loves with dignity does not accept relationships in which they feel diminished, does not justify mistreatment or indifference, and does not stay in a place where their happiness is at risk. True love does not demand the abandonment of self-respect. It reinforces it, because, in the end, love without dignity is not love. It is dependence, submission, and fear of losing someone who in reality has already lost themselves. And no one deserves to live a love where dignity is the price to be paid. Loving with emotional intelligence. Part 7. Love has historically been portrayed as an irrational force, an uncontrollable emotion that seizes the will and governs the lives of those who experience it. We have been taught that love is an unpredictable feeling that must be lived without restrictions, with total surrender, and without rational calculations. However, this perspective has led many people to confuse love with dependence, sacrifice, and unnecessary suffering. Loving with emotional intelligence does not mean loving less. It means loving better. It is understanding that love should not be an uncontrollable whirlwind, but a bond that allows us to grow, respect ourselves, and find balance in our relationships. Emotional intelligence and love involve the ability to recognize, understand, and manage one's emotions within the relationship. It does not mean suppressing feelings or avoiding passion, but rather finding a balance where emotion and reason coexist harmoniously. Many people, when falling in love, give themselves entirely without stopping to reflect on whether the relationship truly brings them well-being or they are merely repeating unhealthy attachment patterns. When love is experienced without emotional intelligence, it becomes a battlefield where emotions dominate entirely, leading to unnecessary conflicts, suffering, and emotional exhaustion. One of the keys to emotional intelligence in love is the ability to set healthy boundaries. Loving does not mean allowing anything or tolerating harmful behaviors in the name of feelings. A person with emotional intelligence knows how to differentiate between genuine love and manipulation, between commitment and submission. In a balanced relationship, both partners have the right to express their needs and expect mutual respect and consideration. Loving with intelligence means being aware of our expectations, recognizing our insecurities, and learning to communicate them without falling into emotional dependence or excessive demands. Assertive communication is another fundamental pillar of emotional intelligence in love. Many couples experience constant conflicts due to their inability to express emotions clearly and respectfully. Some people repress their feelings out of fear of rejection or confrontation, while others react impulsively, letting anger or frustration dictate their words and actions. Emotional intelligence teaches us that expressing what we feel honestly and in a balanced way is essential for building healthy relationships. Knowing how to voice concerns without attacking the other person, learning to listen without reacting defensively, and finding joint solutions instead of engaging in confrontation are skills that strengthen any romantic bond. Another crucial aspect of emotional intelligence in love is managing expectations. Many people enter relationships with preconceived notions about what love should be like, influenced by culture, movies, and idealized romantic stories. They believe their partner should fulfill an ideal perfection, meet all their emotional needs, and fill any internal void they might have. However, these unrealistic expectations lead to frustration and disappointment, as no relationship can be perfect and no person can be the sole source of another's happiness. Loving with intelligence means accepting the other person as they are. with their virtues and flaws without expecting to fit into an idealized image that only exists in fantasy. Emotional regulation also plays a crucial role in how we experience love. Intense emotions are a natural part of any relationship, but when not managed properly, they can become an obstacle. Many couples fall into destructive behavioral patterns due to their inability to control their emotional reactions. Jealousy, insecurity, anger, and fear of abandonment can lead to impulsive behaviors that harm the relationship. A person with emotional intelligence does not let impulses take over, but instead learns to identify their emotions, reflect before acting, and find healthy ways to handle moments of tension. Another essential element of emotional intelligence in love is the ability to adapt to change. Relationships evolve over time, and expecting love to remain exactly as it was in the beginning is one of the main reasons many couples feel frustrated. Emotional intelligence allows us to understand that love is not static, but rather goes through different stages, each with its own challenges and lessons. Knowing how to adapt to these changes, accepting that the initial passion can transform into a deeper love, and learning to renew the connection with a partner are skills that help relationships grow rather than stagnate. Self-awareness is another key to loving with emotional intelligence. Many people seek relationships as a solution to their emotional deficiencies, expecting their partner to fill internal voids they have not learned to handle themselves. However, love should not be an escape route or a way to avoid personal growth. A person who knows themselves, has worked on their self-esteem, and can manage their emotions without relying entirely on their partner is more likely to build a healthy and balanced relationship. Loving from a place of wholeness rather than from lack is the foundation of any strong romantic bond. Empathy is also a fundamental aspect of emotional intelligence in love. Understanding the emotions, thoughts, and needs of a partner strengthens connection and prevents unnecessary conflicts. Many arguments arise because each person focuses on their own perspective without trying to see the situation from the other's point of view. Empathy does not mean justifying harmful behaviors or losing one's own voice in a relationship, but rather developing the ability to listen and understand the other person's feelings. Seeking joint solutions instead of engaging in a battle over who is right. Loving with emotional intelligence also means learning to let go when a relationship is no longer a space of well-being. Many people cling to failing relationships out of fear of loneliness, attachment, or the belief that love can conquer all. However, emotional intelligence helps us recognize when a relationship has stopped being healthy and when it is necessary to end something that no longer brings happiness. Having the emotional maturity to accept that love, in some cases, is not enough to sustain a relationship is one of the most difficult but necessary decisions for personal well-being. Love lived with emotional intelligence is love that allows growth, enables people to be themselves without fear, and provides security and peace rather than anxiety and suffering. It is not about perfect love, but about conscious love, where passion and reason balance each other to build a solid and healthy bond. Loving with intelligence does not mean loving without intensity, but rather loving with clarity, respect, and the certainty that love, when managed well, should not be a burden or a constant struggle. It is a daily choice in which both people work together to build something real, with acceptance, maturity, and emotional responsibility.